Ignatov.
Clinton Ignatov, you got it.
Yeah. Welcome very much to Conversations, and another conversation with a friend of mine, Clinton Ignatov. He's a cyber wise, and not only in the sense of a person who can use the technology to good advantage and so forth, but also understanding it almost in a philosophical system of having very carefully understood the whole course by which the cyber phenomena in the modern world came into being. Has written material on that, and he's also very gifted in terms of understanding how to make the computer work very creatively. And Clinton, we're talking to him up in the reaches north of Toronto. And Clinton, it's good to see you, and welcome to Conversations.
Happy to be back, Harold.
Yeah, it's good to see you, man. So listen, we're here in the. I guess you can't escape the big nation to the south, the United States, but we're coming up to a major primary election next week. We're going to have an election of the House and the Senate and some other elections, and that's going on. So there's a lot of talk within the media about what's going on. Are you following up in Canada? You're in Canada, you're a Canadian citizen. You're also a denizen of cyber issues and so forth. I wonder, do you up in Canada, do you personally, or maybe the people around you and so forth in Canada, pay much attention to the politics of what's going on in the United States? Or do you tend to look to other places to get your sense of Canadian nationalism and that sort of thing? It would just be interesting. I always think of Canada as just like an extension, sort of, almost of the United States and vice versa. But what's the situation from somebody who lives there?
Well, we've got our own politics going on here, lots of interesting things. For instance, the legalization of marijuana in the past week and a half or so.
It's been, wait a minute, that's a major thing. I'm in New York City, and you're going to be doing something around the legalization of marijuana?
It's done.
There'd be lots of people in Manhattan who would be very interested in that. They could be interested in more things like the formation of capital and investment things and things, but what is there? Some sort of a thing done around the issue of marijuana?
Yes, it's been decriminalized and is now being sold by my local provincial government through it's all said and done.
Pot is not illegal.
Pot. The fight has been won for people, at least for legalization of marijuana. Yeah. So what I'm saying is there's lots of stuff going on in Canada to keep us occupied, but I have been trying to keep an eye on things down south. Absolutely. For my own accord.
Let's back up on that Canadian thing, the Canadian cannabis, right?
Yep.
So that's a major thing. Is there anywhere else where they've done that, other countries, or what's the status of that? Believe me, there's a lot of interest in that here as a local issue in our politics also.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't on a state-by-state basis, haven't states like Colorado, for instance, made movements towards those ends. I'm not sure.
But it seems to be a stop and go situation. It's not an all-out thing. Are they giving a thumbs up, the political establishment as such as it's represented in your political system, to the use of the Canadian citizen having open use and legal, totally unobstructed use of
not
cannabis?
Totally unobstructed. There's all sorts of limitations. People can only grow so many plants. You can only smoke weed in such and such designated areas and circumstances. The only retailers have to be it depends province by province, but how it's sold is highly regulated. It's similar to how alcohol sales or tobacco sales would be.
We used to have a thing back in the 30s called prohibition. That was against alcohol. And running rum. They'd be making bathtub gin in a bathtub out of gin and things like that and everything to get to where they could drink alcohol. We had that. And do you have that in Canada also? Looking at
I can speak for Ontario. There was very strict regulation of alcohol in the early 20th century in Ontario, which led to our current setup wherein beer and wine and liquor are only sold by two very specific retailers and a couple of select grocery stores, but you can't walk into any convenience store. You can't go down to, say, the 7-Eleven in Canada and buy a 6-pack of beer you can, or not in Ontario. You can do so in Quebec. You can do so in the States. But in Ontario, yeah, we're still under the regulation lingering from the Prohibition era.
How is the Canadian system different than, let's say, in the United States? We have 50 states, and they have state legislatures and so forth. You have that for each of the provinces and so forth? Are you familiar with the political structuring and the differences? And you also have a prime minister, I think, who's very progressive, if I'm not mistaken. You have a new prime minister in Canada. Is that not true? Young fellow, I think, right?
Trudeau has been the prime minister. Justin Trudeau, son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, has been the prime minister for a couple of years now. Yeah, and he is quite progressive. Yeah. Yes, marijuana has been on his agenda.
And he's got that done now. Is that a?
It's done.
Canadian
it's done and over with. I got people, walking down the street, holding joints, swinging them around, no cares in the world. Yeah.
Is that situation only to the what province is Toronto part of? Is that Ontario?
Oh, well, yes. Each province has their own regulation, but across the country, each province has, in their own way, within their own jurisdiction.
Like our states, right?
Yeah. But the province of Ontario, here. We've got it all. There's posters on the wall in subways reminding people of the new laws, what they can and cannot do. A full government public service announcements, whatnot. Yep. How to smoke pot legally.
That legalization of marijuana, cannabis, is across the country of Canada.
Yep.
That's up in Ontario.
Come on north, you guys. Spend your tourist dollars here. Smoke a joint.
Yeah? Come on. Okay. Well, is there anything else in on that, like say LSD or any of the other kinds of?
No.
No,
not at all.
That, right?
No.
Is it still legal to smoke cigarettes?
Oh yes, certainly.
It is,
certainly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
It's hard to know how these things go on and everything, and it's different in Canada. I always thought Canada's a lovely country. God, it's beautiful and everything. And so that's interesting. And I think that's on the ballot here, is all in a bunch of countries. And do the people in Canada pay attention to the goings-on politically and intellectually down in the United States?
Here's where we get to the crux of what I really like to think about, what I'm working on, and that's how people get their news.
Good.
What constitutes each individual's particular sense-making apparatus? How do you make sense of the world, right? So, from what I can tell, our newspapers and television news broadcasts and whatnot do try to cover events in America in broad strokes. Absolutely. But I'm the sort of person who goes out of his way to really engage in the comment sections, and I have been for 20 years reading.
In the what sections? I'm sorry? In the what sections?
Well, so let's talk about the internet. It's a large place for discussion, and I mean that in the person in the street sort of contemporary discussion, right? You can everywhere there's a newspaper article written, you'll find 500 people in different forums or venues talking about the newspaper article. I agree, I disagree. Well, I'm a conservative. Well, I'm a liberal, right? The internet is a place for discussion and discourse, and has been for us since the 80s, right? So,
is there a sense of camaraderie with the United States? Is there one with Britain? There was a tie to Britain, no, with Canada, or a good deal of it? And you have a traditional link back to the British tradition, as did we here in the United States also.
Well, of course, there's a diversity of opinions on all those issues. In general, I think Canada supports, our friends to the south. There's we have we're part of the Commonwealth as a former British colony.
That's right. So you relate to London, maybe.
Well, sure, and of course there are people who don't like the idea of monarchy, and there's people who do, right? Of course, there's a diverse bunch of opinions on this, but the Queen is, figuratively speaking, our head of state, and the Prime Minister
really?
serves under her auspice.
Queen of England.
On paper, right?
Yeah.
It's right.
The residue of the royalty still holds with Canada?
Oh, absolutely. The Queen's on all of our money. Absolutely.
Now, I'm just trying to make a comparison between Canada and the United States vis-a-vis England, because England was very, very influential in terms of informing the people who made up the political order of the United States as it emerged independent from English sovereignty and so forth. You know, they have that and so forth, and that's interesting. That's interesting to me.
Yes. Canada, we did not have any sort of violent rebellion against Britain the way there was down in the States. We've the French colony, which you know is you might now recognize as largely being Quebec.
Yeah, right.
You know, our national association as Canada, as you know, coming from two separate, distinct European cultures as colonizers built upon land owned by the First Nations people, right? Canadian national identity is all about balancing Canada's history as this sort of mosaic of different cultures who all sparsely occupy our vast geography.
Oh, so there's considerable difference in the historical roots and so forth of one province to another. I guess we have some of that down here too in the States. You know, there's difference between Georgia and New York, or you know, there's difference in that. But we come out of a common bond to to England, no?
Certainly. Actually, I would say that also reflects largely on the internet, because I think the internet is balkanized by language, and so English has been largely the predominant language that the bigger part of the internet speaks, regardless of whether you're from New Zealand or Australia, or whether, I mean, there's plenty of English as a second language speakers across the world, right? It's sort of the de facto language of commerce in a global sense. So the internet has largely been a mixture of voices speaking English without maybe even knowing where they originate.
That's interesting. That really is, because the cyber thing is everywhere, isn't it? Yeah, everybody's got a smartphone everywhere, and that's got is the cyber world in India or in China or Europe or Africa and so forth. The internet is everywhere, and is the basic language that is relating to the use of the internet and its encouragement on the world society English?
Insofar as English speakers innovated and developed the internet first, America got there first. They, you know, it's out of DARPA and out of you know, the various universities in the States who were internetworking their various local computer networks all together into one vast internet, right? In the 80s, that's sort of the generation of the global cyberspace. So it was largely English first, and so yes, there is a Chinese internet that is inaccessible to me, right? Insofar, right, every language has its own corner.
Well, but I'm trying to say, is there a mother tongue for the internet, and is that English? And so
I have to say so. I think so. I mean, that's not.
So the people in China who speak normally from their mother's knee and so forth, Chinese, would in a certain sense feel duty bound to not only learn the cyber terms in Chinese, would be a translation, but would feel duty bound to be conversant in English in order to work effectively with cyber developments in that country, or you know?
That's an interesting question, because that also ties to computer programming languages themselves, which were also largely developed even in the 60s and 50s. Computer languages themselves rely on English terms, right? If this, then that, loop this, right? So yeah, English has always been part of computer programming, just for virtue of, say, a company like IBM being the initial innovators in the field in the early 20th century.
In the early 20th century, that early, it was. What were the roots of that? Was it in the United States where the roots started of the what was to become the internet? Or what's the very beginning of what has become all this cyber takeover of the world? I mean, where did it get started? And
I would place that at the origin of the telegraph. Samuel Morse.
Yeah.
I would say and this is very McLuhan. This is all part of media ecology. I think media ecology is going to be a very interesting field, very essential to making sense of the world today. And yeah, the telegraph as a way of laying down wires which implode space and bring people together and fill your world full of information on, say, your newspaper. 150 years ago, people were reading newspapers that had up to the, day news from across the world, right? People are suddenly involved in stories which take place on a larger geographic scope. I think that's the origin of cyberspace. People's minds and identity and being diffused out of where they live, right? And in a way which is fresher, faster, more immediate than, say, old news that arrives on a train from 2 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, or right for information to travel faster than the letter carrying systems of prior centuries.
I remember living in situations where you had a mailbox up on the road, and there would be a flag that would be up that the mailman would put the mail in an envelope and that kind of thing. And that's all going the way of the dodo bird, I guess, all over the world, but it still exists. And those are the roots of it. And it was intellectually, what were the roots of the internet? Are the roots growing in more or less the United States as the place of nascence and birth of that, or were there other countries and scientific centers of research and development that were involved with the early developments of that, which was to lead to the internet and all of its complexity?
Well, during World War II, I would say everyone was trying to develop, say, ways to do math better, to do logistics better. There were rudimentary computers. It was a race, a technological race, the same way as an arms race. But after World War II, I'd say America definitely came out in the lead insofar as developing computers with companies like, Intel, for instance, is still around, companies like IBM. So yeah, since the 50s and onwards, computer technology and processing has definitely been spreading out of the States. So
out of the United States.
Yeah, with of course lots of things going on all over the place. I can't discount Europe, although I'm not as familiar with the history there per se. But and a lot of it had to do with doing calculations quickly. I mean, during war, that might mean knowing where to how to precisely aim, a cannon or whatnot to account for wind and trajectories and moving targets and that sort of thing. But
was an early part of, or a really important part of technological development. Along with other things. But
of course.
And
now, what interests me is computers as a
called ARPANET.
ARPANET, sure.
See, was an early thing, was it, or not, or what?
In the 70s, you see, here's the interesting thing. In the 60s and 70s, people were looking at computers as high-tech filing cabinets, as databases. As McLuhan says, the content of a new medium is always the old thing. So what can we use a computer for? We can use it as a faster filing cabinet. You don't have to send someone down to walk through the archives and find, drawer AB file number 2, right? You can have it all digitized, right? A way to look up and access information. And it was really discounted how popular communication or human connection or the replacement of, like, say, the mail system and telephone systems, that was really discounted in the beginning until people using it started to goof off on the computer to talk to their friends more than they were to get work done, right? And it's like, no, you're supposed to use the computer as a tool for looking stuff up, not as a way to talk to people. And then slowly became, wait a minute, people are going to use this to talk to people, right? If you read a book like The Virtual Community by Howard Rheingold, really elaborates...
virtual community. Okay, thanks. Go on, lead on. Just talk, my focus has been primarily on microcomputers, which was the term for
computers made up of microchips as opposed to the big refrigerator or the the stories about computers the size of buildings, right? Like computers were these massive things, but as soon as microchips were innovated to create an entire CPU on a single chip that could fit on something that would fit on your desk, that's really where the notion of cyberspace takes off for me, because computers had been these things that you use teletypes to interact with. It's sort of like sitting at a typewriter. You're sitting there at a typewriter and you're typing words, thaka, 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 and then the typewriter types back to you, block, thaka, 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 or you're having a conversation with your typewriter. Right. That was computer interface.
Yeah, we're doing that here with Joseanne, my producer and everything. She just, our director and everything, and she just was doing all, it was typing, we're typing and everything, but it's all going cyber. It's all part of the cyber thing.
That's originally computer monitors, originally they were called glass teletypes.
So it was coming from the teletype, right.
Yeah, it's coming from teletype technology, which is why I think of the telegraph as the true heir to computers at every level.
That is interesting. Yeah, that is interesting in itself. The move up technological use of communication is really important, and it's going now. It's the speed with which the change is coming. You're young and everything, but the speed with which new change enters in, massive change in terms of the implication of that in a progressive way, is very sizable, and it's getting faster all the time, is it not? Is the change coming more rapidly than
McLuhan liked to say that the effects of the car, you don't look at the car itself, you look at all of the changes in the ground of the car. So once you have the car, we have a need for interstate highways. We have a need for gas stations everywhere. We have a need for suburbs that you have to drive then to your job place, right? So the effect of the car is everything around the car that changes as the result of its arrival.
Right,
so
that would affect the lay of the land. I mean,
yes, so what the biggest changes that of technology is not the technology changing so much as how society changes as technology proliferates, as it spreads. I mean, when I was using a computer, I was a nerd, and I was the only one sitting on the bus with headphones watching a movie on the way to school when everyone else was talking with their friends. Right now, 15 years later, you can see half of the people on a city bus are sitting there with a screen and headphones watching something.
Everybody in New York City is looking at a smartphone.
Well, that's it. The technology didn't change. The technology is the same, more or less, as it was 15 years ago. What changed is the advances in manufacturing. The costs go down. You can have more of them. You have cell phone companies subsidizing the cost in exchange for contracts. All of the other changes in society as a result of the arrival of the computer, which only in a very superficially way has changed. I mean, 1 gigahertz, 2 gigahertz, 4 core, 8 core, it doesn't make a difference to 99% of the people. All they know is they got a supercomputer in their pocket that can do anything, right? That's been basically steady with aesthetic changes, or
I would say that's the case. I just came here on the subway in New York City, and everybody in the subway car was working their cell phone with a Droid capability, from a little punk kid of 5 years old to somebody who's 96 years old, and I was the only one who was sitting there wondering, what the hell am I going to do now when everybody else is into their own thing? Do you understand? So I felt
that's a very good issue. I don't see
know how to make the damn thing work, you know. They're making it easier and easier for dumbcoffs like me to use it effectively. Like I'm using it now, but only with the effect of all kinds of outstanding capability by people like Joseanne and the people here at MNN who are so generous in their help for me to do this, because they all understand that I'm hopeless when it comes to understanding how to make it work.
And there's this notion of the digital divide, which you're describing.
That is, there's a lot of people on that other side that, and it's a thing of age too. The younger you are, the more you're adroit, and you just can't understand how come those old guys can't understand it. Right?
Certainly, I think as it stands right now, it's extremely unfair. Yeah. I think it's extremely unfair. We would disservice.
I agree with that as a charter member.
We do a disservice to people like yourself, to anybody. It's a disservice to my parents. I see, you know, my parents struggle with technology.
And they assert their authority over us, and they call us dumbcock, and they don't understand the wisdom and the deep spiritual understanding of the older people. I think they ought to give more respect now that I am one. I didn't necessarily think that when I was 10 or 15, but I'm very much more taking a very careful look at that. There should be more respect for the elders.
That's a very interesting thing for a child of the 60s counterculture like yourself to now be saying at this stage in your, and I respect wholly, and I see it as a matter of, see, computers are very complex devices. And either you learn how to manipulate the interface, you learn how to work the screen, how to work the app, and that's called computer literacy. And children are praised for their computer literacy of learning how an app works, of learning how to use this software, of learning how to make the computer do things.
They keep coming up with new things, new gadgets, new things you can do. You can go to Mars, you can do this, you can do all kinds of things if only you will sit down and learn how, right? If you take a couple of years to learn how to make the damn thing work.
Right, and yet I think further deep down than that, there's actual computer literacy which necessitates understanding all the computer science-y stuff and the logistics and the legalities and the ethics and the privacy implications of how the program works. Because a phone, I pick it up, I talk to you, maybe someone's in the middle listening, like the old telephone operator in a black and white film who's got her ear to
Lily Tomlin used to do that, and the thing she used to do that. Yeah, they would have women people putting people together on a telephone connection. Yeah, do you understand a lot of the movies from the 30s and 40s? They didn't have any. It's just, and it's all coming so very fast now. If the younger you are, the more easy it is to incorporate what it is that's going on, don't you think?
Yeah, well, these analog connections where have been replaced by these digital connections where there's all this potential, this capability for advanced processing to go on between the connection. I think I'm just talking to you, and I'm completely ignorant to what sort of processing could be going on in the middle when you're having a conversation over Facebook or whatever. Not to single out any particular platform. You don't know what you've agreed to when you signed up, whether they're, learning all about you so that the advertisements on your phone are more likely to, affect you, whether or not you're being corralled one way or another politically, whether or not you are being fed things that, tilt you to one particular ideology or whatnot. I don't think individual citizens are empowered with the necessary knowledge to see what's going on with their technology, which is why they have to rely on Silicon Valley or to rely on these big platforms to fix what's on their screen for them. Hey, what I'm seeing here is messing me up. Please, Silicon Valley, fix what's on my screen for me. Right? See, that's totally...
And then Silicon Valley will do that if there's a market niche for that in the market. A lot of it's delivered by the market.
Yeah, it's called the techlash has been the term. It's like a backlash against technology. The way people are waking up to the influences of media are very... it's very sudden, and it's as a result of the last, 4 or 5 years of sudden political upset. And so I'm gunning my engine up on blocks, trying to think of ways to try and spread computer literacy in my own way. And it's a project I've been keeping largely on my website, and I'm very happy to be on your show to discuss it. But yes, I think this is a sort of conversation that requires.
And you've been very good at helping me to understand it. I thank you for that, young man. Okay, because
You're welcome.
That's where you have to get it from somebody else. Because I'm a real challenge in that regard. Because anyway, but so where is it going? Is it going faster? Where is it going to be? Let's say this, instead of talking about what's this year. This is the Christian era, is it not, I guess, as they call it, is 2000.
The year of our Lord, 2018?
The year of our Lord, or the year of our God, or whatever, year of 2018. And where is it going to be in, let's say, 30 years? with the rate, and the rate of the development is just picking. Not only the development itself is picking up, but the rate of the development is picking up exponentially, is it not? In terms of the ability to manipulate information on the heels or in the wake of this cyber development that's come up just overnight, almost since the last 20 years or so. What's its tendency, and what's the rate of this change that it's going to bring to society into the future, as best it can be understood by our leadership, political and or intellectual, in terms of policy that might be on the horizon to be considered, maybe in a political context or in any kind of a decision-making contest?
Well, I think there's going to be a spread based entirely on one's media literacy, where computer literacy, in a deep sense, is a subset of media literacy. So, for instance, I think Neil Postman is a very interesting.
Yeah, I know Neil.
Yeah, he was a very interesting, influential founder in the field of media ecology. Yes, and so indeed. His book, How to Watch TV News, closes with the line, "The wise will not drown." His whole shtick was that since the late 80s, we've been in a glut of information overload, too much information. Right. Everyone says we've got all the world's information in the palm of our hands, and yet all we use our phones for is sharing cute cat videos, right?
I like cats, and I like okay, I understand. Yeah.
So are you going to leave it up to corporations to sort the information for you, or are you going to leave it up to volunteer groups or activists to sort and parse and digest information for you? Who is digesting the information and delivering it to you? How do you get your news? I'm very proactive because I grew up on the internet of the early noughts. In 2001, 2002, I had a very proactive go out there and make up my own sense. I'm an individual, and I'll look at everything I can and make up my own mind sort of sense. But nowadays people are susceptible to just living in a little never-ending feed of things specifically targeted just for them. Oh, we personalize. We know just what you want to see. We got just the deals for you, right? So I think looking at and understanding those bubbles in a language which transcends the language that we use today to discuss social media is very important. There's all sorts of words today that people use. Oh, we have social media, and you've got a platform, and are you going to give a platform to this speaker or to that speaker? People talk about free speech insofar as how a specific web forum should be regulated, right? Should the government regulate speech on this platform? Should private companies be able to give a platform to whoever they want? Should they be forced to fight fake news? How are companies accountable for affecting elections around the world? This all assumes that people are naive, computer illiterate consumers of whatever apps are on their phone. And yet there's enough people like myself who have this earlier proactive mentality of choosing to encounter different perspectives and make up their own mind, which has its dangers. You can go crazy trying to make up your own mind. You go cross-eyed trying to have a parallax of multiple perspectives and trying to create your own depth, your own belief system out of hearing mismatched information and whatnot. People are going nuts online trying to make sense of the world and escape this bubble. So what I'm working on ClintonTheGeek.com is trying to lay a more historically grounded sense of sort of a place to look at the evolution of computers from a informed technological sense, so we can see how people exist in relation to each other, either in ways preordained by social media networks or in ways they creatively make up on their own. Whether you're talking to people who all agree with you, or whether you're going out of your way to find dissent, or you're going out of your way to read studies which have been digested for you by activists and say, hey, you got this study all wrong, right? The discussions which are happening, it's a cultural dialectic which I fear has escaped our institutions. Like, society's making up its own mind outside of the university and academic campus or outside of the political group. The parties are listening to the internet to see what the internet decides what it wants to do, as opposed to being at the forefront of innovating, or being the platform for debates, for discussion, for where the opposing arguments are actually happening, right?
Yeah, and I would have to say that article you wrote, I don't know how long it took you to do it, but that article you wrote on the development of the internet, which you put such tremendous work into, that's a masterwork, if I may say so, in terms of understanding in real terms rather than marketed terms or baloney terms or whatever.
Thank you. That's exactly the intent. Yes, I just released part 3 of my essay, My Cyberspace.
That was a very valuable thing in terms of the reality of the forward movement of this whole thing. It was a major work, and I congratulate you on that. You must have taken a lot of attention to that. It could be recommended to one and all to have a basic understanding of the development of cyber, which is such an important issue confronting mankind. Have you got that out in a published form or something yet?
It's available on my website, clintonthegeek.com. If you head there and you go to the essays section, you'll find all 3 parts of my continuing series. It's autobiographical. I'm trying to tell a human. I'd like computers to be seen as subordinate to humans. I control my computer. I'm trying to tell the story of someone who knows what's going on, someone who doesn't just have this stuff thrown at them and their boss is saying, you got to learn how to use this, right? I'm not
I have very little control over
by computers being thrown at me. I've always been a very proactive, go-get-'em sort of person. So I've written this autobiographical series of essays called My Cyberspace, where I'm explaining computer technology through my own development from a child into now as a young man, as someone who's very, very, I'm a computer obsessed, right? And I mean, I've been doing all this in my spare time. I'd love to meet people who have a more practical use for this sort of thing, but this is sort of a passion project of mine. This isn't anything that's quite paying the bills yet.
Have you ever thought of publishing that, or publishing an expanded version of that into, let's say, a little mini book or something like that that could get
I would love to pursue opportunities in that direction. Absolutely. I've been busy dealing with real life actually for a while now, but that would be great.
Maybe you need an agent or somebody who could deal with the world of publishing and so forth.
Probably.
Yeah, but anyway, you've got the thing, and that kind of thing is needed. And are you optimistic in terms of, you understand it pretty well? Are you? Where is it going? And if it's going exponential, and in fact, the concept of exponential development is something that's hard for people to understand because we're caught up in arithmetic readings of the history of humanity and everything like that. This thing is running way ahead of us, is it not, in a sense?
Absolutely. There's a shearing going on.
Of the computer development, of the extension of human consciousness, is running faster than the normal pattern coming out of human history for development of qualitative technological extensions of consciousness. It's sort of unique in that way.
Yeah, and insofar as qualitative technological extensions of consciousness, when I tend to look at political polarization as a result of whether or not your identity and who you are and how you see the world is coming at you through high-level news and the sort of things that confirm your identity and this is who I am, but I don't talk to people in my real life. I talk to people online. I only find people who are like me online, right? So people who are developing their sense of identity and their sense of the world in isolation, them in a screen, versus people who are perhaps more local, who get most of their sense of identity and develop their beliefs in a more rough and tumble approach to socialization in the world and go out all the time and talk to lots of people and have that sort of
like you've done a lot of, right? And you've also connected with a lot of people who are interested in all of that. And you mentioned Marshall McLuhan, that he was a major Toronto figure who was one of the first people that had an understanding of the importance of that kind of stuff. Do you see yourself in the wake of Mr. McLuhan? And who are some of the other major figures who have been intellectually able to bring some understanding, particularly in this expanded role of it part of the extension of human consciousness itself, if you understand what I mean? Who are some of the other leading figures from the intellectual or political or journalistic world or that you cite or that you see, if you could bring up?
I'm trying to stay within within my own wheelhouse where my strengths are and where I feel comfortable speaking from some sense of authority, and that would insofar as in the field of computers and education and computer literacy, Seymour Papert. Seymour Papert did a fantastic job explaining how computer science or computer programming, the act of computer programming itself, can be bonded with human physical movement and activity. He taught children computer programming by getting them to like run around a room and understand what their body is doing, or how to reduce the act of juggling down to a computer algorithm. This hand does this ball goes there, right? How to merge logical thinking, which is inherent in computer programming, which was something that was huge in computer literacy in the 80s, but which has been largely sidestepped lately.
How do you spell Papert, and what are some of the major words?
Seymour Papert's Mindstorms is a must-read.
The last name. Spell it.
Papert, Papert.
Okay.
And his book Mindstorms is an absolute must-read.
Is he an academic somewhere or what?
Yes, he studied under Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. He was in Europe for a number of years. He studied Piagetian child psychology, and then he built it up within the world of computers. And he saw computers as something which could potentially be used to help the young developing mind, or it could be used as a waste of time that just became a distraction. And he really pressured schools to not just buy computers. He didn't want computers to just enter the classroom because, hey, here's a new thing, every student needs to learn computers. He wanted the curriculum to very specifically focus on how computers should be used, not just as a new up-to-date flashcard mechanism, the old thing and the new, right? He doesn't want computers to drill kids on math. He wants kids to learn programming to have a whole new approach on math, right? So he looked at Euclidean geometry and how that changed the world, and then he looked at Cartesian mathematics and how that changed thinking about the world. And then in Mindstorms, he tries to elaborate computer science as a sort of computer programming as a new paradigm for how to look at all sorts of things in the world, so that computers don't become this cyberspace abstracted from reality, but rather become a part of your perception of the world, a more integral sort of thinking, a merger of computers and machines in a healthy, logical, conscious sort of way. That's what Mindstorms was about.
That's a fantastic book. That's a major charge for the leading edge of human consciousness, I would say. That would be relevant to the political and intellectual class writ large. They could be doing well to be down and investigating that kind of thing. Who else? You got Marshall McLuhan. We have, did you ever get involved with, or you or your group, you're a young man, with Buckminster Fuller or not? Or is that somebody who you're not?
All of my Bucky Fuller knowledge has been through yourself so far, Harold.
Well,
and so I'm on the library waiting list for a couple of his books. I haven't gotten them yet.
My mother bled me with the thing that I am a good source. So that's a good source, Channer. You know, I hate to say that, but Bucky Fuller was great. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be funny. You know, with that, I'm trying to.
Oh, you don't have to be. You don't have to go out of your way for that.
Yeah, right. No, but are you optimistic? Let me ask you, representing youth, okay? Are you optimistic? I did a program. What was his name? The fellow we did, Jojan. What was his name? James Fetzer. He's really a great guy. We did it earlier today on this program, and I asked him the same question for an older man. He's nearly my age, almost, really up there, and I asked him, is he optimistic or pessimistic for the human prospect? And do you ever get a chance, or your age group, let's say, thinking optimistically or pessimistically about the way the planet is being operated under the inherited political and economic thinking of the intellectual class or the leadership class or so forth, or because the implications of it, on one hand, are very ominous for destruction. We've become very, very capable to the point where many of the studies show with clarity that we have weapons systems that have developed in these war-making capability of using it for political purpose, to the point where they have a capability in their destructive capability that is equal to the destruction, if they were unleashed, in the destruction of the entire Homo sapiens species. and it could be regulated and shown to be the case. They exist now, or they have the capability perhaps of doing something very much like liberating the entire Homo sapiens species from a way of living that we were, as James Joyce had Daedalus say, history is a nightmare of injustice. We've never had really comprehensive injustice. There's always been a couple people up in the palace or in the boardroom or something running everything and owning everything and lording it over the masses. Or we might have a thing where we could liberate in a new kind of way, like speciation perhaps, something to get past the zero-sum thinking that for one to win, somebody else has to lose. That's the assumption. If one's winning, somebody else has to lose. We might be at a situation where we can make it a world where everybody wins, non-zero sum. But we assume zero sum for everything now. Do you understand, or anything along those lines?
The imagination reels at the scope of the questions you put there, and of course you've had much more time to sink into big questions like that than I have.
I've had a lot of time. That's right. I'm getting up in years. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so I appreciate. My optimism. See, my perspective for the past few years has been sort of freaking out about how little everyone seems to know about what the internet is, how it works, how communities on the internet work. And so I've been seeing a great increase in the interest of figuring out, hey, just what are we doing to ourselves when we go online and have conversations with everyone across the planet, all willy-nilly, unfiltered, and we try to, there's a lack of the ability to differentiate irony from earnestness in the textual form and the textual communications. There's a proclivity for people to find people who speak just to their heart. This person understands me, and then they go travel across the country and move to a city and join this community of people, perhaps forestalling a phase in their life and protracting it into an entire lifetime, right? The ability to find a bubble of people just for you, right? The way culture is changing and forming so rapidly. I think there's a growing, so long as there's a growing awareness of what it means to get your information and do your own research and online versus connecting with and first feeling at home in your body. Feeling at home where you live, perhaps, or finding that place where you do fit in. But to what degree are people shaping their identity and shaping the world? Because everyone's so empowered to change everything about their environment, change everything about the world, change everything about their life. I think that the faster we can build culture predicated on what it means to live in a world where everyone is so empowered, and to do so responsibly, and to know the stories and to know the common pitfalls, which we are today. For the first time, we're seeing the first generation of people make all the mistakes that future generations will learn from.
History is a nightmare of injustice and also inappropriateness in terms of where we were. But we ought to be a little easy on ourselves, because after all, it was only, like, I was born at a time, 35 I was born, right, and everything. And like, for instance, there was nothing like what would be called television. It didn't exist. And there were all these other things destined to become part of the reality within my lifetime, more or less, or something like that. It's coming so much more rapidly. It's like women maybe understand it more. There's a thing called pregnancy and the birth of a new creature or a new person. And
I've heard of it.
There's a thing called hard labor, and there's a thing, you understand what I'm saying? That it takes a long time, and then when it does come, a change, a qualitative change. It's hard to think that you're in a time of qualitative change. People have thought that. People have thought that about the messianic people they've developed, a Christ or a Messiah or these kind of things. They've come up with systems, but then they had kings and feudal systems and all kinds of things that made it possible. Whoever had the power to insert their own authority over the system would rule, and that's still the legacy in which we live now. We don't have anything like, we were always protected in our impotency at at what would you call it if when a pregnancy is aborted or a abortion or something, by our impotence at being able to destroy our whole species. We could destroy somebody in the other valley or a whole lot of one population or somebody that you identify as the source of all the trouble, and still the process would go on. But now we're reached a point where we can do it with everyone, and there's a thought intellectually that the adverse side of that is a capability to where everybody can be provided with a way in which they can live their full potentiality, rather just very truncated capabilities they're able to develop of their capability for an effective way of participating in the process, like 100 trillion cells in the human organism. Every cell is individual, every cell is part of a system, and every cell can operate in sync with it all. It's called, a way of having a qualitative change. To be born into that kind of a time is a thing that ought to be addressed by people if that is the case. Or is this just another period in history and we can rest on our oars for another couple thousand years or something? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I think there's definitely an inflection point here. And it's been long coming. This is the sort of thing which...
Women know there's a thing called 9 months for a pregnancy. It's not 10, it's not 8. Women know this, all the women. So do you understand what I'm saying? A sense of timing. It's a sense of timing for the whole Homo sapien species. And it's a little hard to be in that kind of a context.
This year was the 200th anniversary of the publishing of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Okay,
and
that's a thought.
Last week at St. Michael's College on the University of Toronto campus, I attended a symposium.
Yeah, I know. You told me that. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And a lot of the sort of questions which we need to grapple for dealing with science and dealing with technology and dealing with the way, especially the internet, for instance, allows us to cast large shadows or have great influence across the entire world.
Right,
one of the talks was very interesting insofar as there was worry about how AI scientists are doing their approach to learning and innovating is very like, let's just do it and see what happens and learn from the mistakes, right? And that's how children learn, right? As a child, you've got to make all the mistakes at a young age and experience and get your hands dirty and rough and tumble and get hurt. But when you apply that sort of approach amplified on a larger scale, you end up with potentially disastrous results. Whereas the smarter thing to do is to survey all the different schools of thought, the humanities, the social sciences, artists, science fiction, try to, prepare a dialogue, a communication, a sense of empathy with all the diverse voices and fields which are fractionated across, the different schools in the curriculum, right? Like, interdisciplinary dialogue is essential, and also the fact that I can sit here, I'm in my bedroom, I can sit up and I can pull up studies and I can pull up different curriculum, and there's a million different university courses on YouTube, and I can just stand up and poke my head and start saying things and gain a following, and everybody's so very empowered, and yet sense of responsibility is something. And, the sense of dialogue and open discourse and the negotiation of how this is going to be regulated or who's in charge or all that stuff, all these questions, I think, are happening right now. And that's where I see the inflection point is this involvement and these discussions, which need to happen within the institutions. I mean, YouTube is the place where people are arguing out the questions that ought to be happening on campuses, where the students with the degrees who are going into the positions of power and influence, who are going to be the ones running the show, they need to be exposed to the sort of discussions which I see are currently happening entirely outside of their sphere, right?
Well, we only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to come in if I could. I mentioned the Buckminster Fuller, and Buckminster Fuller always was somebody he always considered himself not at all a specialist of anything. He was a comprehensivist. He integrated his thinking in terms of all the various disciplines. If you go to the university curriculum and so forth, one of the things that you'll note is they're beginning to associate greater and greater concentration on each and every little fact of the human condition and the reality of the material world, and greater focus on that, so they become very expert on a particular subject, but there's very little systems understanding of the whole thing, having the implications of the whole thing, systematic thinking. And it seems to be the educational process gets some of the best minds so caught up within a specialized view of things that they have a stake in for the book to sell or for whatever reason, or to be accepted. And that specialization is the result of the educational system that ought to be questioned. And one of the things also, if I may, we're now getting down to where the store of human knowledge can be contained within multimedia filmic fare, that you could put the languages of the world behind those things and present it to the whole world without having to go through the thing of trying to translate from each and every specialist. But specialized, I mean, comprehensive study is what we're probably needing more than anything, and there doesn't seem to be any department at the university. Buckminster Fuller said we ought to have a department of everything at the university, and that's laughed at by the specialists who account wide specialization as quality research, you know. That's just a little thought. I don't know what you think of that. Is it too much to try and be a comprehensivist, or allowing that to be free-floating in the of intellectual inquiry? Yeah.
I'll address the second point first, and that is I think that the multimedia method of learning must still be tethered to, I think, language. I think spoken and written language, words, are still have to maintain that tether in order for people to be able to express what they've taken in. If I learn entirely through multimedia, I have to now go paint a picture and write a film script and go do an interpretive dance and learn pantomime in order to communicate outwards in the same form that I learned. Like no, I'd like to be able to just speak and write as the simplest, most wholly integral in the McLuhan sense, the most balanced of the senses and sensorium form of expression. To get to the first point, I think in the past 50, 60 years of what's been largely, roughly called the postmodern condition, where people, where there's so much information and so much stimulation, and we're getting news from all over the world.
And it's increasing all the time.
Yes, people have kept an open mind, and people have lots of different, parts to themselves, which may not be all wholly integral within their being, right? So, and that process of integrating all the different facets of yourself is, well, that's part of growing up, but it's more treacherous than ever in a world where people seek to find things that affirm their biases already, and people don't understand the landscape, the terrain that they're even walking in a technical sense, which is why I see media ecology in the sense from, Neil Postman is great, Marshall McLuhan, sure, but the whole field of learning just what it is that you're looking at, what is behind, what is conveying to you the spectacle that you're taking in, right? Where's media coming from? How is what you see on television different from what you read in a newspaper, even if they're both talking about the same thing? What does it mean for someone to just get famous on YouTube overnight, and what is their opinion worth when 20 million people are watching them, but they're just a person who sits around playing video games all day, right? And shooting off like a casual comedian, right?
Well, very well said. Unfortunately, there comes a time we've run out of time, and that's one of the problems in the universe. We're running out of time to get some solution to these things. Thanks for contributing mightily to the process, particularly from a younger youth's perspective, and I congratulate you on the work. Look forward to talking to you in the future, and we invite you to tune in on the viewing audience, tune in later to a later. There's always interesting talk on conversations. I'm here to say my mother used to agree with me and my dog. And so I just wanted to let that know. My mother thought I was really very, very special. Very unusual for a mother. But anyway, that's it for now. Thanks for talking. We'll be catching up with you, pal, okay?
Thanks, Harold.
My pleasure. Okay, that's it then. We're done.